Welcome and thank you for joining us for our first program of the Grantmakers in the Arts 2019 Narrative Change Series. Grantmakers in the Arts is a national membership association of public and private arts and culture funders. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, Program Manager for GIA. At this time, please take a moment to complete the poll at the left of your screen. We're glad you made it and we want to know who is in the room. GIA is a community of practice with a shared vision of investing in arts and culture as a strategy for social change. One of the major issues we are exploring is dominant or mainstream narratives that continue to live on and perpetuate racialized practices and outcomes. With a system that is not broken but rather structured intentionally to foster inequitable and unjust outcomes, the need for narrative change is more urgent now than ever. To paraphrase the words of journalist Ella Saltmarsh, narrative change frequently involves collaboration across differences and brings together actors with very different positions to re-envision the goals of a system and to change it. We seek to elevate the importance of changing narratives among arts and culture funders, and we're glad to hear from Vanessa Camarena-Arredondo and Rinku Sen on this webinar, Arts Funding, Storytelling, and the Importance of Narrative Change. Vanessa Camarena-Arredondo is the beloved Community Fund Program Officer of Akonadi Foundation. She brings to the foundation over 20 years of experience promoting social equity in communities of color through her work in philanthropy, the arts and culture sector, community health, and as a leadership development coach. Rinku Sen is a writer and political strategist. She is the former executive director of Race Forward and was publisher of their award-winning news site, Colorlines. Under Sen's leadership, Race Forward generated some of the most impactful racial justice successes of recent years, including Drop the I Word, a campaign for media outlets to stop referring to immigrants as illegal, resulting in the Associated Press, USA Today, LA Times, and many more outlets changing their practice. We're glad to have them present on this webinar. At the very end of the presentation, I will be joining to facilitate a Q&A. With that, I will turn it over to our presenters. Welcome, Vanessa and Rinku. Rinku, why don't you get us started?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sherilyn. Really appreciate joining this webinar, and welcome to all of the participants. Really, really glad to be here talking to you about this particular question of creativity in social change making, social justice change making, and how to measure it, what to look for, how to know that we're on the right track. So I am going to dive right into my slides here and remind us all that it doesn't matter so much what happens in the world, it matters much more what we all think happened, whether we have a common story about the event that took place or disparate stories that we need to unify in some way or deal with in some way. So stories are really everything in life, and that applies to the social change process as well. One example from history of how the arts and how the arts have shaped a national narrative and had an effect on actual people, actual human beings, comes from the Mexican mural movement. The beginning of that movement is pegged to the 1920s, right after the Mexican Revolution happened, and there was a new government in place, and that government needed to reunify the Mexican people after a civil war, what had essentially been a civil war. So from the artist sector, people really pressed that government, that post-revolutionary government, to make art available to all people, and not just to emphasize the art coming out of Europe and the art of the colonizer, but to raise up indigenous people, the indigenous people of Mexico, and their experiences, their history, their culture, their art. So, so that movement actually pressured the Mexican government to make space available and to fund and encourage the mural movement, and this is one example of it. So from this example, we can see how a new set of characters is being lifted up in a national narrative, and how the Mexican identity is shifting through this art from a colonizer's identity, really a white identity, to a mestizo identity. So we're asserting a whole new national identity right here. And just one last note on this, the Mexican mural movement also inspired the Chicano movement for political change here in the United States. So that is you know, large scale, happened over a long period of time. Now the Mexican mural movement and the art that it produced is considered high art and, you know, talked about in all sorts of mainstream ways. But when it was happening, it was extremely controversial, and it was a point of actual organizing to get these murals up and available to the people. So when we're looking at anything that we want to change the story on, and anything that we want to develop a communication strategy on, and for me, communications includes art, I think of that as a as having three elements. And those elements are a frame that is based in values, hopefully shared values with the people that you're wanting to influence through the art. The second part is a narrative and stories that actually fill in that frame, that give those values life in the listeners or the readers or the viewers' imagination. And then the last element is the message, and the message is going to include a very specific thing that you want people to do. So often when people talk about communication strategy in social change work, they really focus on the message, and this was particularly true about 10 years ago. There was a lot of, or even 15 years ago, there was a lot of noticing happening on the liberal to left end of the political spectrum about how much we, on the progressive side, focus on facts and figures and data, and the solution seemed to be, let's focus on the message instead. So there was a lot of activity and a lot of people saying, oh, if we could just get our message right, then we would win. But actually, you have to get the frame right and the stories right, and then the message right. The message is not going to be adequate if the frame and the narrative haven't been strategically developed. So I'll just give you a quick example from my own history. In 2011, Race Forward released a report called Shattered Families, which was about the way in which Obama-era deportations had led to the children of deportees winding up in the child welfare system and in foster care and eventually being adopted out, and the parental rights of the deported parent severed. So we did this report, and I'm just going to share our communication strategy on it. The dominant frame on immigration at the time was law and order. It still is. The frame that we pushed was family unity and the sanctity of families. That was how we set up our values to compete with the dominant value. The narratives on the dominant end were always about immigrants breaking the law, and many of those stories were not actually true, but they fit very well into a worldview that said immigration is all about law and order. Our stories with the report were about families being separated and the deep harm of that. And then the message in the dominant strategy was deport, 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 and our message was stop deportations so that we could stop separating kids from their parents permanently. So I hope that gives you an example of how a group or a coalition or a change effort might think through their communication strategy. Now, why are narratives so critical to making that strategy work? It's because the human brain, evolutionarily speaking, is hardwired for stories. We almost can't learn something unless it is in the form of a story or comes at us in the form of a story. And that happens partly because the brain gets bored, but and wants entertainment, but it also happens because our brains develop dominant kind of ideas about things, dominant frames that themselves get hardwired into our brains through repetition. So those frames are so well established that you can't really attack them directly. You have to get to them indirectly through the stories that by changing the stories that establish the frames. So one of the reasons that stories are so critical for organizing is that because stories have a familiar structure, a beginning, middle, and end, and some other elements that I'll cover in a minute, we can recognize the structure of stories even if the protagonist is a person very, very different from us. So we partly recognize stories because they're framed with values that we share, and we partly recognize stories because they all happen in the same way. They all get told in the same way. And if a story is really good, the engagement of the viewer, the reader, the listener is involuntary. So I don't have to have decided before I watch the movie Beaches that I'm going to cry at the end of Beaches. But Beaches is a really good movie, and when I watch it, I get caught up, and my body actually begins to go through the reactions that the protagonist and the characters in the film have. So really great art, really great storytelling has this effect of being able to push out a dominant frame in the brain of the person who is engaged in that narrative. And that is not, that's a gift you don't want to squander. If you have a chance to change somebody's dominant frame, you want to take it. And story is generally going to give you the best way. So lots of times when I talk to people about narratives and I say, tell me a story about your kid's school or tell me about the availability of food in your neighborhood, what they'll actually give me is a description. They'll say, in my child's school, there's no toilet paper, they don't have any computers, the books are from 1985. But I have said, tell me a story, and what I don't get in that description is I don't really get a character. I don't follow your child through their school day. I get some elements of setting from a description, but it's not tied to a character, and often I don't get good setting. Nothing happens in the descriptions that people are giving me. Sometimes I will say, tell me a story about welfare reform, and folks will show me their policy platform and say, this is our policy narrative. But no, it's not a narrative because there are no characters, there's no setting, and nothing happens in a policy platform. It's a static document. So policy platforms are super important, but they're not a narrative. In order to have a narrative, you have to actually tell a story with characters, setting, a plot, things that happen, and an idea, a moral grounding it. So I'd love to just look at an example right now, and let's take a look at this video that was created by the Greater Than Fear campaign that ran through Minnesota for the midterm elections. And okay, here we go.
In Minnesota, we know long winters, and we know how to dig our neighbors out of the snow. Because whether it's our first Minnesota winter or our 50th, we've all been there. So when certain politicians want to divide us and make us afraid, we know that means they've got nothing else to offer. We're on to them. There are lots of ways to be Minnesotan, and all of them are greater than fear. In Minnesota, we're better off together. Vote greater than fear between now and November 6th.
Okay, great. So I just want to point out a few things about this video in terms of the narrative elements that we looked at. So we have characters, they are neighbors, they are multiracial. We have a setting, it's got snow in it, there are homes, there are roads. It's clearly a cold place where people have to help each other out, the setting. And then we have action in the actual helping, people digging each other out of the snow. And then we have an idea which is implied, and the idea is that love and courage are greater than fear, and that Minnesotans are made up of love and courage more than they are made up of fear. We don't have to vote our fear. We don't have to live our fear. We can help each other out and get to be greater than fear. So I think I love this video because in 37 seconds it has all of the elements that I need to lead me to an action, which is a vote, and it has a shared, it comes at me with a value that I share, which is the value of courage and connection. So that's an example. I want to take us now through some of the advantages and challenges, broadly writ, of pursuing a narrative change strategy. So when you have a narrative strategy, that is what makes it actually possible for us to reframe ideas and debates and to take the debate off of whatever has been dominant through repetition and centuries of establishment and narrative, all kinds of narratives that fit into that set of values. A narrative strategy is what allows us to actually reframe the debate and recharacterize our people from however the dominant story has characterized us. So if we want, I do racial justice work, so if I want to, disrupt the idea that black people in the United States have been taking things for the last 400 years, and everything the system tries to give them, they just take it and abuse it. If I want to disrupt that idea, then I have a central part of my strategy has to be getting narratives out into the country in a ubiquitous way so that they are everywhere, that presents black folks as agents of community change and family change and life change and taking care of themselves and each other and the country. So narrative strategies allow us to actually recharacterize our people without without always recharacterize our people and give us back our agency. Narrative strategies help reprime brains to address implicit bias, and they trigger subversive frames like the idea that family sanctity should be a goal of our immigration policy. Now, it's not all like fun and games and easy. It's pretty challenging work, and some of the challenges are that the dominant frames are so pervasive, they're so easy for us to reinforce. Almost every time we talk about how immigrants work really hard, we have to really consider whether we are reinforcing a dominant frame that immigrants are only here to work, that their only contribution is economic. So they're very easy to reinforce, and you can do it without meaning to. Stories are always about individuals, as I said. They have characters, and you're following those characters through a set of actions. But systems, the systemic problems that we are dealing with, systems are always about groups and patterns, and it can be challenging to make interesting stories about characters that also teach a lot about the system without making it not good art, like art that just is trying to hit people over the head too much. And then organizing and change is so much about solutions as well as systems. And in general, solutions can be duller, more dull than problem stories, conflict stories. So the key there is, as all of us on this call know, every solution generates contradictions and often new problems and new challenges. So if you're building narratives around solutions, it's important often to talk about what are the obstacles to those solutions becoming the dominant solutions. So narrative strategy is a really important thing to engage in, but I want us to be aware of some of the places where we might get stuck or might encounter some challenges. Finally, this is my last slide, how do you measure the impact of narrative strategies, whether those strategies are engaging mural art or films or television shows or poster campaigns, or I could think of all sorts of other things, coloring books, I don't know, so many things to make art through, so many media. So the first thing that you might consider is, what is this process and product doing for the development of our constituency? Is it waking people up? Is it explaining how the system works? Is it generating sympathy for somebody we should feel sympathetic toward? Is it creating connections between people, cultural, emotional, intellectual? Is it unifying people? Is it giving people courage to act? Those are some of the kinds of constituency development markers or indicators we might consider. The second big category is discourse. Is it changing the conversation about things? One of my favorite projects, contemporary projects, is called For Freedoms, FOR, For Freedoms, which is takes a series of paintings that were created by Norman Rockwell in the 20th century, kind of beloved middle America paintings that are about 4 different values. And in the For Freedoms mix, they've recreated those paintings with whole new characters, multiracial set of characters, and shifts in some of the way you think about the values. So that that's an effort to change what Americans think of when they think of freedom of speech, freedom from want, freedom to gather, things like that. So are we shifting the discourse? Are people using our language? Is an image really ubiquitous? Those are the kinds of indicators in discourse, and there are many more. And then finally, particularly for the social change funders on this here in this webinar, social change funders are always concerned with institutional and policy change, and narrative shift is really key to getting those kinds of changes as well, but they're not always going to be drawable through a direct line. You're going to see policy change and policy efforts much more through, is there a constituency developing and growing to demand a particular policy, the end to incarceration, for example, and is the discourse starting to make room for our actual ideas about what is wrong in the system, who's responsible for that, and what kinds of alternatives and solutions we actually need, and who would be responsible for those. So constituency development, discourse shift, and ultimately institutional change or systemic change are still the things that you can measure in a narrative shift strategy. I will close there and just remind us all that the process of creativity, creative policy making, creative organizing, creative art making. It's all creativity, and all of it can be helping us move toward a story of the nation that actually moves us forward and together. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Rinku. It's wonderful to hear from you, to learn from you, and just thank you so much for your leadership. And thank you to everybody who's on the call today. I know everybody is experimenting with this in the places that you're all at, and we look forward to learning more. It's wonderful to have an opportunity to be in dialogue. So what I'd like to do is share a little bit with you about how Akonadi has been in practice around looking at narrative change in our by funding our grant partners. And first off, I wanted to say that there's definitely national work happening, with the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter that's really asking us as a nation to think about women and Black people in a different way. And then there's local efforts that are doing similar things. And that's what I'll focus on today, is like how Akonadi is supporting local work that's involved in this intersection. Just to give you a quick overview of what I'll present, I'll give you an overview of the grant making here of Akonadi. Then I'll talk a little bit about research that we commissioned with the Kenneth Rainin Foundation to map groups here in Oakland that are, well, I'll tell you a little bit more about the research in a minute, but, and then we'll do some grantee profiles just to show you the work in action here in Oakland, and I'll share with you some of the practices that we have kind of come around to using to do this work in as best of a way as we can. So first of all, the Akonadi Foundation was founded in the year 2000 by Quinn Delaney and Wayne Jordan, and it was established. They established it to fund racial justice organizing and movement building. And it was national, then it came local to Oakland, and we've given over, the foundation has given over 1,600 grants totaling over $40 million. And in 2013, they established the Beloved Community Fund under the leadership of Quinn Delaney and the artist Melanie Cervantes, who was a longtime program officer here. And the idea was to establish a fund that looked at how culture really influences social justice and change making here and shifts policies, to all the points that Rinku raised. And I just wanted to give you an overview of our mission here and also the values that we lead with. So the values that kind of propel us forward are racial justice, centering racial justice, really looking at communities of color to lead, looking at intersectionality and looking at leadership from the field, from people who are most impacted, and looking at cultural expression as a way to impact our goals around racial justice. So let's see here. So first off is this research that so my predecessor here at the foundation, Sheena Johnson, was in conversation with Shelley Trott over at the Kenneth Rainin Foundation to talk about, well, who are these groups? Where are they located? How do they make their work happen? What are their needs? How are we serving them? How are we not serving them as a field of philanthropy? And what can we do to improve that, right? So in a city like Oakland that's known as as an immigrant city, how can we stop and take a look at these groups? And so this was some benchmark research to look at a pool of 138 groups whose budget sizes are $250K and under, and so we worked with the Creative Equity Research Partners to really, or they led the research actually, to be in dialogue with many of our grantee partners that were shared by the City of Oakland as well, and the Zellerbach Community, the Zellerbach Foundation. And we asked them, what do you need? How do you do your work? And please visit the website at Map Arts Culture Oakland to see the recommendations that they had to offer us and some of the stories around how they piece their work together. And many of them are severely underfunded, but really doing so much to offer Oakland just a sense of vibrancy and belonging. So we saw this research one as a way to really respond to Helicon's research, which many of you are probably familiar with, not just the money, that here in the Bay Area and across the nation, we know that less and less dollars are actually, there's a decline in dollars going to people of color-led institutions, right? And so if we're centering racial justice in this work, how can we kind of take a look, learn from these groups, and really look at building infrastructure? So this is the first point of advocacy, and we're so grateful to our partners over at the Kenneth Reagan Foundation, because it's just a wonderful opportunity to get to learn with local colleagues, right? And this has definitely involved other local foundations as well. And what we learned from this research is that, again, what many of you might be familiar with is that groups are really looking for more general operating support, which is not available. But there's not a lot of general ops support here locally, and in order to really build infrastructure. So part of that is like, how do we engage in a conversation both internally and with our colleagues around how we can help these communities really build that infrastructure that they deserve, right? So that was something that we encourage, right, is to figure out how we can use research to advocate for these groups. Next, what I'd like to do is share with you a few grantee profiles from across both very centrally cultural organizations to social justice kind of organizing and movement building organizations. So the first I wanted to share with you was Karen Senefru's The Black Woman is God. And this was really created or established by a local Oakland artist, right? A black woman named Karen Senefru. And as we know, many of our artists are problem solving from their own practice as artists. And so what she decided to do was make this kind of bring a collective of black artists together to share space, to exhibit at several galleries throughout Oakland and San Francisco, to center really the contribution of black women in Oakland and really everywhere, right? And so part of what is interesting is that the narrative shift that they're engaged in, one is an internal fortification, like how is there places of belonging and solidarity and collectivity among black women locally, and then what is the resonance that, or how does the kind of the message get out about centering just how we can really lift up and support black women, and this art project has had resonance we've seen in the Caribbean, nationally. So they really use this title to shift the narrative around how black women are viewed locally and nationally. And I just want to point you to an interesting report recently that just came out from the Nielsen report called African American Women, Our Science, Her Magic. So this idea of studying what many have heard of as black girl magic, right? And what it says is that black women are trendsetters and early adopters who are very much concerned with a positive image that impacts their communities in positive ways. Next, what I'd like to share with you is a group in East Oakland. And East Oakland is a poor and working class neighborhood here in Oakland with a rich, vibrant, really cultural fabric of immigrant communities, black communities, black immigrant, African immigrant communities, Muslim. And so 67 Sueños is a youth-led organization that uses culture and healing spaces and muralism to offer a message, right, in the vein of narrative shift, to offer a message to the local community about really the value that we see within our communities in light of the aggressive kind of negative and circumstances that are coming from our leadership in this country. So this mural here says, "No human being is illegal, and everyone has a dream." So that is one campaign that they were engaged in. This is a huge, beautiful mural over here in the Bay Area. And the other campaign was a campaign called Paperless But Not Powerless. So again, the idea is like, what is the internal fortification? What do people need from within their communities? What's the messaging and the narrative that gives people agency to then engage in organizing organizing fights to improve their conditions, right, and to assert and demand what they need in our community. So these young people are seen as total leaders, and really it comes from the art that they're making in community, the murals that they're making, and really this multiracial alliance building where they're bringing undocumented youth together with Black youth and with Muslim youth, and really the youth, they come from these different backgrounds, but they're all Oakland kids. You know, everybody identifies as being from Oakland primarily, and so what is that opportunity that they're capitalizing on to use the sense of belonging and uplifting their collective and individual cultures? And so, but they are now serving as advisors with the local city colleges on how the city colleges can create opportunities for undocumented youth, and really just some stellar advocacy happening through this very small organization. And then lastly, what I wanted to share with you from the grantee perspective is the Black Organizing Project. And the Black Organizing Project is an organizing, kind of classic organizing organization. But what's interesting about the cultural intersection is that, one, this organization was started by a group of 4 artists. And so I think sometimes we compartmentalize, oh, the artist is here and the activist is there, and really part of what you know we see really is that they're one and the same many times. That there's the artist organizer who's really dreaming in the Wakanda kind of and Okanda vein of like, what is the world that we want to see, and how do we create agency within our communities to be on that fight, to be on that path that is a long one. There's a long history and tradition of this, right, in many of our communities, of using culture as a way to fortify people, bring them together, and then create organizers and activists of them. So this group actually did, before they actually had or campaign demands, they were just busy building and having food and music together and making art together before they even created any demands, right? And so, but then what they've gone on to do is be one of our leading groups here locally, and they've created this campaign called the Black Sanctuary Pledge. And what it is they've asked people, again, in the vein of narrative strategy, to think of schools as a place of sanctuary for Black families, for Black children, which, as you can imagine, in a city like Oakland, where the press that goes out about our city is that Black people are killing each other, and that there's all of these, and there's not an opportunity within that narrative to really actually care for Black people. And so that is what they are shifting here, actively shifting. And they've had some beautiful wins in that vein, including they established an MOU with OUSD and the Oakland School Police Department, because we have police in schools here, to not question youth without their parents present. So they were able to establish that MOU, which is, and their campaign really is to get police out of schools, because of how that just leads to our youth then going into prisons. And so that's one of their central campaigns, and the campaign essentially, the pledge, urges teachers, allies, and other school administrators to pledge to not contribute to the mass incarceration and criminalization of Black youth by calling police on students for nonviolent behavior. So again, these are different ways that our grant partners are looking at narrative, are looking at shifting the way that their communities are viewed, and centering culture as a practice of establishing what that new place, that place that we want for our communities, that place of belonging and survival. So, well, thriving, not survival, really. And lastly, oops, I went the wrong way here. What I'd like to share is some of these practices. And again, this is a living document, so we are not claiming to have it all figured out. We're absolutely learning alongside you, and would love to learn from you. But here are some practices that we've centered in, and one of them, I guess, that's not captured here is this idea of like establishing trust. And trying to be in communities, reaching out to communities, and a lot of people have been talking about how there isn't risk capital for people of color. Like, you either have to do it right and have perfect financials and have a perfect application before coming to the door, right? And so, and whereas, you know, we're here in the tech capital of the world, and there's so much risk capital for these companies, right? So what we want to understand is, like, this isn't risk capital, but this is opportunity capital, right? How do we build the opportunities for people to figure out their work and build infrastructure? So one of the things that we recommend is really figuring out how to lead with racial justice. I think equity has been a popular word in our field, and there's good things with that frame as well. But the idea of centering race and really pointing the structural racism that and looking at ways that we can center race to address structural racism, right? So part of that is, how can you establish racial justice goals within your foundations, and hire people from the field, give them the support and they need to be in our institutions, which aren't always easy to be in, right? And again, establish trust with the partners in the field, inviting them in to apply, or figuring out ways that we can really create the infrastructure so that they can apply and they can be successful in our applications. So the other thing that we recommend is this idea of investing in infrastructure. So a lot of the times our grant partners are kind of chasing after project grants, and that's something that we're learning and kind of coming into, is like, how can we actually create more core operating multi-year support that goes directly to these communities. So a lot of times we have institutions that come into communities of color, poor and working class communities, to offer programs, and some of those are good. Some of those are good, right? But how if we invest in leadership from these communities, does that actually create long-standing investments that will last over time, because we're making an investment in both leaders and institutions that are committed, that are from these communities. And lastly, the last thing I'll leave you with is this idea of watching for hidden biases. So, are our applications complicated? Do we preference one group over another because one feels like a more secure investment than another? And really, what are we saying there? And might those be proxies that actually keep people out that haven't had the opportunity to build infrastructure? And us as people working in philanthropy, what are ways that, whether it's through kind of capacity building support that helps them build that infrastructure, getting them consultants, and really just, I guess, in some instances, just taking the chance to fund these groups. Because what we've seen is that we've seen, 30-year-old organizations such as, like, the Lower Bottom Players here, they've been around for forever, but there's still, like, a lack of trust that they around the structure of their organization, right? Their financials and this kind of thing. But yet they do programming year after year after year, and we look to them as leaders. So again, we don't have this all figured out, but this is something that we have to offer, and we look forward to learning from you as well. I'll stop there, Steve, and maybe, Sherilyn, we can open it up for some questions.
Sure, that sounds great. I want to say first, thank you both, Rinku and Vanessa. That was an awesome presentation. Rinku, I thought it was great when you just kind of put everything together and sort of like frame, first step, setting the frame, then figuring out what the actual narrative is, what's the story here that we're trying to get out, and then moving on to the message. What's the message that you want to get out in the end, right? So kind of going through those stages. And then Vanessa, I thought it was great you noting specific examples of the types of organizations that funders can fund for when funders are doing narrative change work or racial justice work, and thinking about taking risks when the infrastructure isn't necessarily perfectly crafted and, ready to go, but kind of like in progress. So I think those are really great points that you both made. And we'll dive right into our Q&A. So when you're asking your question, please be specific about who the question is for. And just a reminder to ask your questions in the rectangular box at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so we will start off right now. We've got one question in. So this first question is for Vanessa. So the person asks, leadership is obviously important, and highlighting indigenous leadership in communities of color addresses a common problem of funders relying on outsiders better positioned to meet funding criteria. Are there other aspects of what you could speak to regarding direct funding to indigenous leadership? What are the other important aspects of infrastructure? You mentioned capacity building.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, I think that there's definitely great local kind of capacity building programs that try to build relationship among institutions, so grant makers and artists and community members, so that some of the programs kind of last over a few years or at least a year or two to really establish that relationship. And some funders are in relationship with those communities, right? And that trust is being established. But I think that having run a small nonprofit myself, there were ways that I tried to, let's see, let me collect myself here, figure out ways to both execute on the work and build those relationships was often a challenge, right? Because people are stretched thin. And so, but I think what gave me room as a leader were those investments. So there's often time where you're trying to produce so much and respond to really your primary community, which is the community that you're creating work for, that then building a relationship and finding time to really cultivate a relationship and cultivate trust with funders is a whole other body of work, right? And so I guess what I'm curious about is like how we as funders can understand what are our questions, what are our fears around like our boards, how can we talk to our colleagues around just having more trust and faith in people, or establishing possibly a good relationship with a local fiscal sponsor that can do some of that work that we aren't able to do as funders, but can help these organizations. And I think it's really important that they have kind of that they have a race lens, right? That they want to work with communities of color, and they don't want to work with communities of color in a way that penalizes or undermines them, right? But so, and how can we as staff broker those relationships and maybe cover fiscal sponsorship fees? I hope I'm answering your question. I think that what part of what I was trying to get at is that the programs that kind of helicopter into community aren't necessarily building infrastructure in the community. They contribute to it, but how can we look at building trust over the long haul and helping organizations either buy a building or invest in them over 3 years and general operating support, knowing that they'll execute on their programs because they have a history of doing that. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you noted some very key points: building trust, funding, and funding general operating support. I think those are very, very clear, concrete things that do address the question. So thank you for that, Vanessa. Our next question is for either speaker, Vanessa or Rinku. The person asks, in working with local organizations which don't have the same orientation or structures that our funders ask, how do we find ways to document the work from a narrative, financial, and impact perspective?
Rinku, would you like to start that?
Rinku, yeah, I can go first on that. So I think if the question is about actually documenting the work, that is collecting data and evidence and tracking the work while it's going on, then there are a few things to keep in mind that are important. So one thing is that you want to set some impact goals, or local organizations that are taking on this work would want to set their impact goals on the front end. So, and they can be broad and flexible, but there has to be something that at the beginning of a project that says, this is why we're doing it, and this is what we hope to get out of it. We hope to reach the people on this one particular block that we don't have saturated, or we hope to provide material that can help resolve a conflict, a cultural conflict that's taking place between a couple of our folks. So whatever the effort is, whatever size, and even if it's very internal to the organization, like we want to change a particular story within our organization, starting with goals for the impact would be important. And then from there, you would figure out, well, how are we going to know that whether or not we had this impact? And this is where often folks get stuck between, get stuck in jargon. So sometimes we stop at the goal of actually producing something. So all our goals for measurement are we produced this, we produced that, we made this happen, people came. But for measuring impact, you'd want to go deeper. So if 50 people came to a play, what did they think? What effect did the play have on them? So if you know at the beginning that we're going to put on a play, we want 50 people to come, and we want them to have X insight into the topic of the play, then you also know that after the play happens, you have to interview people or have them fill out a little survey, or you have to conduct some kind of, quick conversation so you can see whether the product affected people in the way that you intended and hoped for. So, but if you don't have the goals at the beginning, then it's very easy to miss the pieces of work that you have to do to actually measure impact along the way. Maybe I'll just stop there for a second, see if Vanessa wants to come in, and then I can come back if we haven't addressed something in this question that's important.
Sure. Yeah, I think the way that I see us as people like working in like program officers or working in philanthropy is that we are storytellers ourselves, right, with our boards and with our colleagues. And so I think part of what, and I think I'm getting a part of your question, but is this idea of like what are the common values between these groups you might want to, like you're looking at funding and the goals of your foundation, right? And how do us working in philanthropy really tell that story of like the match of values and as far as impact is concerned, what we've been trying to do here, and evaluation is not always an easy thing, right? But is to think about what are the goals our organizations have for having impact in their communities, and what are the goals that our boards and leadership have designed, and what is the marriage there? How do we? And what my thoughts are that a lot of it is around values. Around a values alignment, and then there is impact alignment. So sometimes with the cultural work, unless there's like direct policy change happening with a group like the Black Organizing Project, that there's a way that that we could use as a field to figure out how do we tell the story of that kind of like gray matter, the stars in between, the small stars in between the big constellation of what culture does, right? How narrative happens over time. And so I think that I'm probably not the expert to offer you exact advice on that, but I know that there's other people working on that in our field. But again, just that idea of being translators between the work we want to fund in our boards and how really we're how to tell the story of alignment and really track the story of alignment so that we are satisfying what our boards want to see. And as far as financials are concerned and that kind of thing, there's this wonderful organization run by Carol Cantwell called Fun with Financials, and she really challenges the idea of like what are we asking when we want to know about financials? Because oftentimes for folks who have run nonprofits, budgets can be kind of like precise and accurate, and sometimes when people are applying to for funds, they're kind of, it's a little bit of a general idea, right? It's not an exact science. And so if we know that about financials, what is it that we want? Are we concerned? Are we concerned about who's getting paid? Are we concerned about leadership? Are we concerned about the ratio of what money goes to artists and what money goes to administrators? What's the tension there? And so unpacking that a little bit as opposed to just kind of like, oh, I need these financials in 3 years of 990s, and that actually tells me that things are being spent and programming is happening in the right way. Is that really, are we asking artists to be financial experts? And if we're not, then how do we invest in, again, possibly consultant support or fiscal sponsor support to help them demonstrate that. Yeah, always happy to talk offline though if anybody needs support.
And can I just add a few things that are actual documentation things you might want to gather? So one that is evaluations. So evaluations from any activities that are happening, notes from conferences, panels, meetings, discussions. Those notes are historically so important, and almost none of us keep them and keep them safe. Photos and videos, journal entries. So artists tend to keep journals about the creative process. Those would be important to, like if you're running a program, you might want to have artists in training keep journals through that period. You might want to have organizers keep journals, etc. You definitely want to collect numbers wherever they're available to be collected. You could consider doing longitudinal studies or surveys where you interview a set of people, before they enter, I don't know, a play, we can use the play example again, or a concert, and then interview them again a year later to see what developed for them 6 months or a year later. Those are a few quick thoughts I have about the kinds of things that one could collect.
I love those ideas, especially the photos and videos. And the one thing that I will say for small arts organizations, having the infrastructure to do surveys can be challenging. So again, just careful with that, although any kind of notes and evaluations that they are able to generate. I've also had thoughts around how can a foundation actually hold an evaluation tool that audiences can tap into, that kind of thing. But those are wonderful examples. Thank you, Rinku.
Great. So we've got one more question, and this is for both of you. So can you say a little bit more about evaluation indicators for good artwork? And of course that's very much based on opinion, but also we are familiar with the narratives around Eurocentric art, being considered higher on the on the totem pole, if you will. Looking at it in a hierarchical way, and that's not in fact true. And so what are some things that funders, or really anyone, can consider when thinking about what art to fund and what good quality art is, or what that even means?
I'll say a little something about that. I think that with quality art, I think we want to look at the impact the art has on the community that it's intended to serve. And so if the quality may be something challenging for us as working in philanthropy to assess if we're not from the community that the art is happening in. So I would actually look to how it resonates with the community that it exists in, right? And that look at that as a measurement. And that might be a little bit, take a little bit more research or exercise to kind of get out and assess that. But I think that there's some pitfalls with thinking about quality in a way that creates a hierarchy of good art versus bad art. So again, I think community impact is one of the things that we've looked at here at Akonadi.
I'll just add a couple of thoughts here. Totally agree that art has to be measured based on its intention. So you can't evaluate a romantic comedy as a mystery because it's not meant to be a thriller and mystery. You have to evaluate it as a romantic comedy. And likewise, when something is made in a community that you're working with, the only measure can't be, does it get into the local art museum? Because if in fact its intention is to generate conversation or a new feeling or an assertion in a particular community. So really, really agree with that. And the question is, what is the intention of the art? And a second thought I'll add is I think it's very important on this question of measuring high art and folk art and street art to invest in arts criticism. So the way that someone like Kehinde Wiley becomes major is, of course, he's a grand talent, a genius, but also his work gets reviewed and critiqued. Arts criticism is not always negative critique, of course, but it gets reviewed, and in the review comes to the attention of audiences and finds its audience. And you can invest in arts criticism locally as well. There are hyper-local newspapers. Funders could invest in training up, local young of color film and television and art critics, music critics. So I think thinking about the field of art criticism and how it helps to get subversive art out into the world, including its own local world, that would be an important arena to consider.
Great. Well, thank you both for all of the information that you shared on the presentations and responding to questions. That was really powerful, and so glad that we had you both for our kickoff for the Narrative Change series. And for everyone else, today's presentation has been recorded, and we will be sending you a link to the file and the presentation slides within the next few days. We invite you to take a brief survey that we will share immediately following the webinar. Your feedback is always important to us and helps us in the design of future webinars. If you have further questions, you can feel free to reach out to me, Sherilyn Seeley. Thank you again to Rinku and Vanessa, and we hope you will continue to join us on the Narrative Change series as we move through it this year. Our next program will be in July, so be on the lookout, and thank you again for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.